Chapter 13. Bedtime Stories. The sun was shining on the sea, shining with all his might. He did his very best to make the billows smooth and bright, and this was odd, because it was the middle of the night. The moon was shining sulkily, because she thought the sun had no business to be there after the day was done. "It's very rude of him," she said, "to come and spoil the fun." The sea was wet as it could be. The sands were dry as dry. You could not see a cloud, because no cloud was in the sky. No birds were flying overhead. There were no birds to fly. The walrus and the carpenter were walking close at hand. They wept like any to see such quantities of sand. "If this were only cleared away," they said, "it would be grand. If 7 maids with 7 mops swept it for half a year, do you suppose," the walrus said, "that they could get it clear?" "I doubt it," said the carpenter, and shed a bitter tear. Oysters, come and walk with us," the walrus did beseech. "A pleasant walk, a pleasant talk, along the briny beach. We cannot do with more than 4, to give a hand to each." The eldest oyster looked at him, but never a word he said. The eldest oyster winked his eye and shook his heavy head, meaning to say he did not choose to leave the oyster bed. But 4 young oysters hurried up, all eager for the treat. Their coats were brushed, their faces washed, their shoes were clean and neat. And this was odd, because, they hadn't any feet. 4 other oysters followed them, and yet another 4. Thick and fast they came at last, and more and more and more, all hopping through the frothy waves and scrambling to the shore. The walrus and the carpenter walked on a mile or so, and then they rested on a rock conveniently low. And all the little oysters stood and waited in a row. "The time has come," the walrus said, "to talk of many things, of shoes and ships and sealing wax, of cabbages and kings, and why the sea is boiling hot, and whether pigs have wings." "But wait a bit," the oysters cried, "before we have our chat, for some of us are out of breath, and all of us are fat." "No hurry," said the carpenter. They thanked him much for that. "I wish you were not quite so deaf. I've had to ask you twice. It seems a shame," the walrus said, "to play them such a trick, after we've brought them out so far and made them trot so quick." The carpenter said nothing, but the butter's spread too thick. "I weep for you," the walrus said. "I deeply sympathize." With sobs and tears he sorted out those of the largest size, holding his pocket handkerchief before his streaming eyes. "Oh, oysters," said the carpenter, "you've had a pleasant run. Shall we be trotting home again?" But the answer came there none. And this was scarcely odd, because they'd eaten every one. By the time the brothers finished their tale, the entire camp lay fast asleep. Chapter 14. Looking Glass Mountain. What felt like a short time later, I awoke to heavy fog and the quiet rustling of my companions. "Alan, we must be off," said Hatter as he stood over me and pulled me to my feet. As I stood up, I caught sight of the faces of the creatures around me who looked as dreary as the weather, knowing the long journey still ahead of us. After a fond farewell from our feathered friends, with the promise to meet again, and stocking up on tea and biscuits, 5 of us pressed on and marched to the Looking-Glass Mountain. Through forests, over rivers and hills, and across great plains, we walked. Our odd little company finally came to it, and all of us stood in awe of the great land beast that loomed high in the clouds. The mountain's sharp wind whipped our faces as if to demonstrate its great strength. Without a word, Hatter led our troop up the monster that was to be our destination. I still have some disbelief as to how a tall man with a top hat, a stranger with nothing but a famous name, twin leprechauns, and a hare were able to fight the wind and scale the mountain. However, we did, and when we reached the frigid peak, we once again stood in awe of what awaited us there. The twins were the first to speak. "The Looking-Glass," they spoke faintly in unison. The hare gulped fearfully, as if he wished the two were wrong. Hatter took a silent step forward toward the mirror that stood alone on the windy peak. He gave it a tap with the staff and said, "I think Alan should lead us through it." I exhaled. "Me? Oh, no, Hatter. You've led us this far. Why stop now?" He then turned to face me, spinning on his heels, elbows resting on his staff. "We are almost to the White Queen's castle," he said cheerfully, "and I see it only fitting the Queen see the champion of Wonderland leading us through her gates." He then stepped aside to give me a clear path of travel through the mirror. He acted as though I make sport out of running through glass on top of a mountain. As I tried to back away from him and reject the offer, I felt 2 stocky hands on my back, one from each of the brothers. "Don't worry, lad," Dum said with the finishing. "It'll be over quick." With anticipation growing, the hare began to shake nervously, biting his nails and trying to disappear behind the pot which rested between his ears. Knowing the group's patience would soon waver, I picked up my bag of journals, took a deep breath of mountain air, closed my eyes, and before long, my heart beat fast and loud as I charged through the mirror. The first impact took my breath away as I was hit by an icy gust, but as I ran deeper into the looking-glass and out the other side, I felt a very strange warmth. Chapter 15. The Chessboard Desert. The warmth on the other side of the mirror intensified, and I was greeted by a bright, blinding light. When I opened my eyes, I saw the creatures of our troop scattered around the ground. As I gathered myself, I gazed around the barren landscape where nothing grew or lived. So this is the Chessboard Desert, I thought to myself. What do we do now? I said aloud, hoping for someone to answer. Hatter spoke as he came to stand beside me, pointing his staff toward the horizon. Follow him. At first I couldn't see who he was referring to, but then it was as if the sun guided my eyes. Off in the distance, I could see a man atop a strong-looking horse, sporting gleaming armor. Hatter prodded all of us to stand at attention as the man rode to address the group. The man's horse stopped right in front of the March Hare and snorted in greeting, which caused the timid rabbit to cower behind Dee and Dum. The man in armor then turned to me and spotted the journals on my back and said, So it is you." Dum spoke rapidly. "And I am me, that is Dee, Hatter, and the Hare." To break the tension, the Hare jumped up from behind the twins and exclaimed, "And that's a horse. Care for some tea?" Ignoring the offer, the man addressed me again. "I am Knight, captain of the Queen's Royal Guard. I've been sent to accompany you to the castle. Shall we be underway, sire?" I found it kind of odd that the captain of the guard called me that, but I didn't question it, and before long we were following the knight to our destination. We walked in the desert heat, passing a handful of outposts, where soldiers would bow as we passed. I commented to the knight on the bowing of his men. "They're so loyal to you." The knight replied, "Aye, but not just to me. They're also loyal to the White Queen, Wonderland, and to you, Alan." Puzzled, I yelled, "Me? Why would they bow to me?" Knight replied, "They've been waiting for you. We all have. You're as much their leader as the Queen." It was in shocked silence I stayed for the remainder of the trek, until we saw the castle waiting in the distance. A winding pathway appeared to lead to the main gate. As we walked down this path, closer and closer to the gate, soldiers knelt, bowing on both sides of our group. The soldiers then paired off and surrounded us as they led us to a space in front of the gate. I stood in awe of the number of men around me. Once again, every man took a knee, but before I could formally speak to them, I saw it wasn't me they were bowing to. Instead, they bowed to the figure that stood at the head of the congregation. That's going to wrap up another episode, guys, and we'll see you in the next one.